Well, hello everybody. Welcome to the Engaged in Intelligence Trust podcast number 7. Today, Ben and I are lucky to have with us Paul Johnson, who's the Managing Director of BarenBrug UK, and he's going to take us through his perspectives on trust, particularly working with organizations, customers, clients, suppliers, and more recently, some acquisitions and mergers that the business has been through. So without further ado, over to you, Paul. Perhaps you could go and introduce yourself, please.
Thanks, John. My name is Paul Johnson. I'm currently the Managing Director of BarenBrug UK Limited. BarenBrug are a specialist plant breeder based in Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk. The company breeds new species and varieties of grass plants, both for the agricultural and the amenity industries. So we have some quite well-known customers such as St Andrews and one or two of the Premiership football grounds. I've been with the company for 29 years, and during that time, the company has shown some remarkable growth from a turnover of 3 million and 12 staff to today at 28 million turnover and 75 staff. Majority of that growth has been largely organic, but we've had 2 goodwill acquisitions, and ensuring that those people who came from those companies and ensuring their commitment is a vital part of the journey. And part of that was creating a really good trusting environment in which they felt able to discuss and ask questions of how the business was growing and where it was going was absolutely vital. So from that perspective, I think building a trust business has been extremely important to us over the years.
That's great, Paul. Thank you. It sounds like very exciting times and seen a lot over your 29 years. So I guess we'll start with a more generic question is, how do you as a business leader know that your business is functioning on the basis of trust?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, which I've discussed with colleagues within the business, is how do we know that we really have got that foundation of trust in the business? And I think what I hear back from people is that trust is a conviction that's built very slowly over a long period of time, and it's built through repeated interactions. But to me, a high trust organization is one in which the employees feel very safe to take risks, to express themselves very freely, and are happy to innovate and put forward new ideas in the business. I feel that when trust is installed inside an organization such as ours, that tasks are really accomplished with less difficulty because people are more likely to collaborate with each other, to communicate with each other, and it gives a much more productive output. And I say as a result that the outcome tends to be more successful with that. And that's a good way of measuring whether the business is showing that foundation there.
So thank you for that. That was an incredibly strong answer and resonates with what we've heard throughout this podcast and throughout our research in the area of trust. And as you said, trust takes a long time to build. But one of the problems with trust is it can be very easily lost. So although it's a long time to build, it can fall down very quickly. So as the leader of a company and as the leader of a group of leaders within your business, who is accountable for ensuring that you don't get that loss of trust?
Gosh, that's in terms of who is accountable, well, I think trust is one of the most vital forms of capital that a leader really has today, particularly among the turbulence and the global uncertainty that we're experiencing, all of us. I think people are increasingly turning to their employees and their business leaders as a source of truth, and trust is the foundation of that at the end of the day. So all leaders, including myself, play a pivotal role, I think, in setting that cultural tone and establishing the behavioral norms within the business. And our focus is on trust. If it's on the trust, it directly impacts that communication, the collaboration and the innovation, and empowering everybody in the business to shape the future of the organization. But it certainly has to come from the top, as do many things in business today. It's the way the person at the top behaves and supports its staff and its people and its culture is hugely important. And I think also as the organization grows, which we have, it's been crucial to continue investing in that leadership development, to make sure that that investment not only equips the next generation of leaders, which are constantly coming through the business, they need the skills and the tools to build trust within their teams themselves. But it also, at the end of the day, underscores the integral role that that person plays in the company's future. So ultimately, I think it's the leaders who set the tone for trust within an organization. You have to invest in that leadership training and development. It takes time, it takes money, But if you do that, I think the organization becomes a lot more successful, better team performance, and ultimately a higher productivity at the end of the day.
No, actually, that makes total sense. It's really interesting because just building on your point about flowing down from the top, we've had all sorts of management gurus over the years talk about flatter organizations and delayering and etc. In my experience and what I've seen in all the work I've done, both in operations and consultancy, you can't get rid of the pyramid. Everything stems from the top and you need to flow it down. The trick, of course, is making sure that the people down in the organization are enabled. It's like leadership development to go and do the work. So you need to have a quality assurance process, and you also need to develop people. But just sort of a slight tangent from that, Paul. You've talked about trust over the years as the company's grown, has developed. There must have been some wobbles at some point. I mean, no organization has it, without necessarily going into the details or the specifics of the wobbles, right? How would you see that a lack of trust manifests itself in the business, and you may not have had any, of course, but it would be interesting to know what your views in terms of that is.
Well, of course, we've had some problems with what businesses haven't, and when you're bringing new people into an environment they're not used to, it creates a lot of fear about change and fear about them individually. So it takes time to show people it's a trusted organization. For me, I mean, you can read lots of books and it talks about a lot of detail about how you can tell if your business is lacking trust. But I personally think there are some very personal things that you can look for in a business. In a sense, on the flip side of that question, I guess it's employees are often engaged in office politics and infighting. I think that's a very obvious example that there's a lack of trust in the business. What that tends to do is to withhold information and withhold resources, and that creates a much slower and less effective team or company at the end of the day. I think the other one that we do see sometimes is envy, which, I mean, envy is a universal trait at the end of the day. But I think if it's left unchecked in the workplace, it does lead to some problems. Envious people desire what their successful colleagues have, there's no doubt about it. And that can lead to a lot of resentment, short-sightedness, and sometimes really toxic relationships, which we have experienced at a senior level as well as at lower and junior level. And once that toxic environment is there, it can rush across the company very quickly. And I think just even smaller things that you keep an eye out. Sometimes a colleague will come out with an idea and another colleague will actually steal it and say it's their idea. And we've had that in the past, and I think that's really quite dishonest. But gossip, I think, probably is the one that indicates that something isn't quite right. It's a bad sign in the business when a colleague seems very preoccupied with gossiping, putting out rumors, hurting other people. We have had that. And I think at the end of the day, it's difficult to deal with, but it has to be dealt with. And I think it's I remember my father saying to me, there's an old school rule here that if a person is gossiping and he's talking to you and gossiping behind people's backs, he's probably doing exactly the same thing about you to other people. That's very true. And I think these people can be very undermining in the office. And it's important that colleagues feel that they can talk about it and deal with that in the business. And at the end of the day, we can deal with it as a company as well. Another rule, I think it's interesting when he's talking about people, I do like one or two of those old rules in the sense, and when people are in the business, I look at it from a sense of 20% of my people are doing an absolutely fantastic job, working well above the requirement, putting a lot of work into it. 70% of people are working at the right level and again doing a good job, but maybe 10% are not performing well, perhaps shouldn't be there. It's a bit of a rule, but I have to say in my experience, it's not bad rule at the end of the day to sort of keep in mind that that's sort of flow of people within the business, John.
No, it's interesting you say that actually, because I'm going to bring Ben in a minute. That actually resonates with one of the chapters in my book, where I talk about the green, amber, red model, and the split. It's very true. It's a heuristic, but it does show that way. And I think these days, you have to really consider how you deal with those 10% of those people, because they can cause a lot of trouble. It's not just about underperforming, it's the toxicity. And I recently just finished Stephen Bartlett's book, Diary of a CEO, where he interviews an American lady realtor, very successful. And they were talking about the importance of actually dealing with toxic people very, very quickly. and not letting things fester. I think that's the thing. So yeah, Ben, I know you've got a bit of experience in this area as well, so just like to bring you in on this one.
Yeah, so I think there is a very big difference between toxicity and poor performance. You can have people who are poorly performing who are actually very good culturally for the company, and you can have particularly, you can have spectacular performers who can be toxic. And one of the good things about toxicity, at least, is managers are always very aware of it because it is the toxic 5% who take up most of the manager's time. So you have a very good path to identifying it. So from my perspective, toxic people have to be handled. And they can actually you can sometimes solve the problem very easily. I come from a background of technology companies, and actually you can quite often solve the problem of toxicity there purely by pointing out how other people are perceiving their behavior. And you can have a night and day change very quickly. But I think there are also deeper problems sometimes that have to be handled through your more standard HR paths. Paul, have you come across any particular ways of handling people who are negatively impacting trust within organizations?
Yeah, indeed. But what you said resounds with me, because I think you're right. I mean, we've had toxic people in the business. When we've pointed out the problems, they've been horrified, absolutely shocked. Didn't realize it was them, didn't realize they were doing it. I'm sure at the end of the day, people have their own problems, they have their own lives, and sometimes that comes across in their work environment. And I think those people genuinely are really shocked, and with help, or just immediately will train their way. Like, we've had people who've just gone and apologized to the person they've been upsetting, and that's really nice to see, and that person grows. Then there are the people who really are toxic, maybe in their personal life, they're having problems, etc., but they really are toxic to the business. And I think that's very, very difficult to work with sometimes. And sometimes the only way of dealing with that is to ask them to leave the business, really, if it's that bad. We have had coaching, we've had training, which has worked, and I think it's pointed out some of the problems that people have had. And one of those, probably at the end of the day, is imposter syndrome, which can play its part in toxic relationships. So I was very amazed, I guess. We had a good training session for the last 2 years, and one of them has been the imposter syndrome. And I have to say that training course is fully equipped with people. Everybody likes to go on that course. And we have seen people come out of there saying, wow, I didn't realize that was where I was. And it's made a very positive difference to the business. But I think it is important to talk about it. I mean, a toxic environment at the end of the day will ultimately erode productivity in the workplace. There's no doubt about it. And the good people leave first, Ben. That's the problem. It's a real shocker when it gets stuck into the business, and that can be very disappointing from a development of people's perspective.
Yeah, I mean, that all makes sense. I mean, we're talking about the really negative people there. But earlier on in the conversation, you talked about potentially flipping the positive people. As you said, some people just don't know. I've been in situations where we've had people who've been, I wouldn't say toxic, but disruptive, right? Because it's not quite the same thing, who have been, in the past highly recognized, very experienced. And then you have to start asking the question, why? Why have they changed? Why have they flipped? And, a lot of the time it's because they're not being recognized anymore. They've either been alienated for whatever reason, they've been moved sideways, but they've still got a huge value to bring to the organization. And I know numerous times, both in operations and when I've been consulting, and we've come across these people, we've basically actually asked them to be mentors for youth people. They're getting nearer the end of their career. They still want to give, and they're frustrated because they're being ignored. So the best thing to do is don't ignore them, right? Turn that negative energy, that disruptive energy, into more positive energy so they can contribute. And it's an absolute win-win. They love it, and the staff who are they're mentoring love it. And particularly, when an organization sees a potentially disruptive person flip to a more positive side, it's hugely enabling for everybody. It's a big instant hit, and I'm sure you guys have seen that yourselves. So, so Paul, Matt, what do you see are, you touched on training and coaching, and particularly the course you had on imposter syndrome. What do you see as the ways of mitigating a lack of trust in an organization?
Yeah, at a time when distrust seems to be the default at the moment, fostering this high trust organization has never been so important. And as we said earlier, it just starts with leadership at the top, right through the business. And I think there are 3 or 4 key things that we can do as leaders within the business. And the first one is to be transparent. And what does that mean? I think it means sharing information openly and candidly, keeping the teams updated on what's happening in the company and what the senior leadership level are looking for in the business. But then they don't withhold resources from employees or make decisions in secret. If departments are struggling, find a way of resourcing that department to get them through that particular project, etc. I think people like feedback. They like regular feedback. It's very important to be clear about the team vision and what the expectations are of the team members. And to encourage that open communication and by creating that environment where people feel comfortable to speak up, as I said earlier, and to voice their opinions. And I think something that we're all learning, and as an older person in the business, it's about being authentic. I think at the end of the day, people today are very clever. People know body language. They know what happens to people. So being authentic is very important. It's much easier to be authentic. Coming to work with your work face on, I don't think particularly works well today. So it's starting with that person with self-awareness. Leaders only become authentic when they begin to know who they really are, what they value and what they're good at and what they're bad at, and to start looking at emotional intelligence and how emotionally intelligent are they, and more importantly, how do their colleagues perceive them in the business at the end of the day. And being authentic means perhaps showing a bit of vulnerability, which is difficult for people in leadership. When leaders reveal their sort of trip-ups and their failures, it can be seen as a negative by some people, but I actually think it makes you more approachable. You're seen as being less arrogant, but it's not easy, and I understand why people do that. But I think maybe start by sharing what you've done, the past mistakes and the good things. Embrace that journey, because I think it can be a bit tricky. But I think the rewards of it and the people who are working with you is huge. And I think that probably the last one that I say is very important in these areas is basically be reliable at the end of the day. Follow through on what you committed to. We must ensure that our actions align with what we're saying. We all heard it, talk the talk, but don't walk the walk. People who work for you and work with you will quickly lose faith in you as a leader if they can't rely on you to do as you say at the end of the day. So it's important that that's there. Establishing expertise. People don't expect their leaders to know everything. We can't know everything, but we do as a leader need to hold a certain level of confidence in are we capable of the job we're doing? And I think to build that confidence, it's making sure that we give sound evidence that we do understand things. We understand the industry we're working in. We understand what's happening in terms of trends to give insights. And we understand to a degree what resources are needed to enable the team to function correctly. So if we can demonstrate integrity, if we can demonstrate fairness, I think all team members will be able to rely on us for fair treatment. They'll be more positive. They'll be looking for growth opportunities openly. And it will provide all those team members with a real good basic set to develop their own skill base and work through projects and develop themselves at the same time. And I think those 3 things are important today for a leader. It's about leading, not managing today.
Mm. So, yeah, you covered so many points there, Paul, and I'm going to bring Ben back in a minute again and yourself before we close. So I'd like to see if I can connect a few things there. I think early in your discussion, you talked about showing up in the way that you show up at home, not your work face. I think that's quite interesting. There's a lot of research around there. I know in some of the work we've done in coaching with the Energy Leadership Index, people will say, well, I'm not like that at work, or I'm not like that at home. You are who you are, right? And it will be obvious and evident to people when you walk through the door. So I think that's an extremely powerful point. I think your point about vulnerability is also important. Sometimes the Japanese, they talk about confident humility. It's okay to be, humble, right? And confident at the same time. Sometimes people think it's mutually exclusive. And I think vulnerability, as long as it's not overused, it's a bit like self-deprecating humor, is a very powerful, approach. I don't like the word tool. There's a couple of other things that you touched on there as well. You talked about expertise, reliability, and integrity. And interestingly enough, in Amelia Dunlop and Ashley Reitman's book on the Trust Index, they have those factors of trust: integrity, reliability, and expertise. So that really does, make a very strong point and connection. And I think the other thing, which you talked about earlier on in the conversation, Paul, was that it takes time to build trust, and it's quite easy to knock down. One of the analogies we have is trust is like a three-legged stool. If you can imagine the base is the stool, and you've got transparency, which you touched on, authenticity and consistency. You knock one of the legs away, the stool falls over, sort of very quickly, but it's quite difficult to sort of get it back up again. So before we come to close, because we're getting in near the end now. So any final reflections, Ben, and then just to close, then Paul. So.
The one thing that jumped out at me from what Paul was saying, he was talking about how to demonstrate trust through being trustworthy. So Paul was talking about being transparent, because transparency helps people trust you because they can see what you're doing, and being consistent because that helps people trust you because they can predict how you're going to behave. What's interesting there is that transparency also requires trust. The reason people stop being transparent is because they're afraid of how the transparency is going to be responded to by other people. So there is always this two-directional part of trust, and I think Paul would probably agree with me that it's up to the leaders to make the initial leap of faith to start building that two-way cycle in order to grow the trust overall.
Yeah, I think if a company loses trust, or you go into a company where trust is not there, it's not part of the company as a leader. I think when trust is compromised, the first step is to acknowledge the issue and to talk about it, to admit the mistakes, and when you talk about it and express genuine remorse, you're going to rebuild something. It's got to be genuine. You can't just pretend. So transparency, as you talked about, Ben, there, I think is the key to regaining trust. That open and honest communication demonstrates a commitment to rebuilding those relationships. I think it's also important that you identify what the root cause is, what's been the problem. And then it's very, very critical to the process to make changes based on that investigation at the end of the day. And therefore, it's important to engage with all the stakeholders throughout the process and ensure they're involved in that investigation. And then from there, you've got to basically be very honest and keep people updated, put the training in place and the regular progress assessments. So I think regaining trust, really can take a long time, but you have to be persistent. You have to be consistent. And it's very important that the leaders in the business at the top stays dedicated to the actions that you've agreed, and they demonstrate, as you say, Ben, right from the top downwards towards a genuine, and I say genuine, commitment to rebuilding that trust with the staff. And I think but how long it takes, wow, that depends on how deep it is and how good we are at getting it back again at the end of the day.
Oh, that's great, Paul. Thank you. Thanks for finishing on. That's a really powerful message to send to our leaders about what it's going to take. And it's not easy at the end of the day. There's no pain, no gain. And the pain there, of course, is actually putting the effort in, the commitment, being genuine. I love your point about the genuine remorse. That's really important as well. So, right, well, without further ado, we've come to the end of the podcast. So wonderful to have you again. Paul, thanks very much for being our expert guest today. And I'm sure people will be able to reach out to you on LinkedIn if they want to talk to you further about some of your experiences and support, etc. And we'll be posting this in the usual channels, guys, and look forward to our next podcast number 8. So thank you very much indeed, gentlemen.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Paul.